and welcome to another episode of Our Town here on the Kahnawake Mohawk Television Network. I'm your host, Regan Jacobs, and today in studio with us we have the Executive Director of Kahnawake Sagot Digenhas Community Services. And welcome to studio.
Thank you.
Derek.
Pleasure to be here.
So I don't think we've interviewed you in quite a long time. I think it's been a couple of years.
At least, if ever interviewed. I remember doing an interview with at the old place regarding I think I was on Walk in My World.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was related
maybe it was
or not.
Michael Dell's show.
Yeah. Oh, maybe.
Well, I promise not to be too hard on you. You know, I wanted to bring you in studio to talk a bit about the presentation that you had given at the community meeting. I believe it was last month.
Yeah.
I heard a lot of good feedback regarding the.
Glad to hear that.
Yeah, the presentation. A lot of people said it was really eye-opening. But first of all, let's just go back a little bit. Now, your new role isn't so new. You've been there for almost a year now in the role as the executive director. Tell us a little bit about how that's been going.
Well, I think being any executive director in Kahnawake is a challenge, but it's extremely exciting. I'm very hopeful, very optimistic about where we're headed. I've had a lot of good feedback so far and positive feedback. I've been in the position since April 1st of 2012, so it's officially 1 year as of a couple days ago. I was actually in a transition for about 6 months before that with Linda, so we were kind of both doing the roles as we transitioned the information and knowledge, responsibilities, funding, all of the different portfolios, if you will, over to me, and then she retired effective April 1st, so took over from there. I was able to, I think, start right away. We redid our whole, we've overhauled our whole performance management system, and that's been a huge undertaking to try to accomplish in 1 year. But we have a good system we feel comfortable with. I think there's always be tweaks and bugs that you got to work out, but it's exciting.
Well, when you
about
say
that.
Performance management system, that seems like a really big. Not big words, but it's like, whoa, what are you talking about? So what are you talking about when you,
with any employee, any business, any company out there, you want to be able to evaluate how somebody's doing. You're paying somebody to do a job. Are they doing that job effectively? That's ultimately the bottom line for any type of business.
Okay.
And ultimately that means some type of annual performance appraisal. So at KSCS, we used to have, years ago, a one-page performance appraisal. And it didn't really encompass what needed to be evaluated on an individual. They redid the whole process, became more medicine wheel approach, so much more traditional. The challenge with that system that they developed is it wasn't directly linked to their job descriptions or what they were actually doing. It was more related to personal characteristics.
Okay.
So this one that we've developed now hopefully kind of matches the best of all the worlds. It is more related to tasks they're assigned or key tasks, as well as their job description and standard behaviors that we expect out of any employee, and standard behaviors that we'd expect out of any supervisor. You know, we want there should be consistency in any and all supervisors on how they're delivering supervision and how they're leading their teams. So we wanted to create that as well.
Okay.
We also implemented a year-long system as opposed to just annually. So there's quarterly progress reports that each supervisor has to complete for a final culminating in an
It would be
annual,
easier to go that route than
well,
to
then you're
just
only
wait.
evaluating every 3 months, right?
Exactly.
Rather than what happened
in
back
January.
in last March.
Yeah. Okay. You did mention earlier that there are some challenges being an executive director here in Kahnawake. What are some of those challenges?
Well, I think number one is with the present financial situation throughout the world, let alone Kahnawake, there's always the concept of how are we going to deliver the best service, the right service, which will create the biggest impact for the community with the limited funding we have. There are so many needs, and really that was a big part of the community meeting, was to talk about some of the social issues that are happening in the community. But how KSCS can't do it alone. And many of us recognize what you look out the window, you read the newspapers or the other media, you see some of the challenges that are happening. How are we as a community going to come together to meet these? So as executive director, a lot of times people come to you for questions or answers that you don't necessarily have right away, or to try to put it in a perspective of what's that global picture that you want to try to keep focusing on, so that whatever the situation arises, it still speaks back to that vision that we have for the community.
Do you feel that there's a pressure on you personally, living in such a small community, that you are the kind of the voice of community services in that role? Because there is a lot of attention on the positions that hold such high regard in the community.
Well, at times I do. I think when I'm not aware, it kind of sneaks up on you, and you feel the weight of the world, if you will. It can get overwhelming if you start thinking, oh my God, I have to do this, I have to do that, because there is a lot to address. You know, whether it's elder services, assisted living, support services like psychology or addictions or youth protection or prevention activities. There's a lot of different areas, even internal, administration, reception, all of those internal operations, human resources, complaints coming in. So you're bombarded with a lot of different things. The key is just to taking it one piece at a time. Always remembering to, okay, what's the link back to the big picture to make sure it's in the right direction, so my decisions are consistent, if you will. That's I think the biggest challenge.
I'm not sure how the hierarchy works at community services, but is it, your managers and then everybody reports back to you, managers, directors, then you, or,
Well, the biggest, I guess, optimistic change that I'm trying to help put in place, and it's not just me, don't bear in mind, but it's with the board of directors. The board of directors, I guess just to explain first of all, KSCS, or Mohawk Council of Kahnawake, decentralized certain levels of authority as far back as 1986. Some maybe before. Kahnawake, or KSCS, received its mandate, I think it was in 86, which was really to handle health and social services. Health meaning in collaboration with hospital, obviously they had some specific things.
Right.
With that, a board of directors was put in place. I guess what I've noticed coming in within the last year is that sometimes there was a lack of understanding with the board about their role as opposed to the executive director's role.
Okay.
So my first goal, I guess, or the board's goal more than my goal, is to reestablish their role as a governing body and setting governance policies, setting what is the vision for the organization that they as a board of directors envision to happen, and really they're responsible for the strategic plan. Now, I don't mean to say that they're alone in drafting the vision and strategic plan. It's obviously in collaboration with the organization itself, but ultimately they're setting that tone of direction we're supposed to be going. I'm the only employee of the board of directors, whereas all the other employees ultimately are responsible to me. Okay. So that's that link between the board of directors. So they set the parameters for me of what box I need to operate under and what vision or direction I need to try to achieve. The next one down is directors. So we have 3 directors, 4 managers who report to one of them, as well as other team leaders, and then the staff, frontline staff themselves. So that's, I guess, the hierarchy of it.
Well, I mean, it's interesting in a small community how these things work, but we're gonna come right back to that. I can see my camera guy flagging us down for a quick commercial break. Don't go away. We'll be right back. You're watching Our Town here on the Kahnawake Television Network. Stay tuned. And welcome back to Our Town here on the Kahnawake Mohawk Television Network. And if you are just tuning in or you're staying with us, we have the Executive Director of Kahnawake Sagot Digenhas Community Services in studio with us today. And we were just talking about the new role that's been over a year now and how things are going, and also just getting a little bit familiar with some of the changes that are happening in your organization. Let's skip now to the community meeting of last month, where I understand that you did a presentation there. Could you give us a little bit of an understanding of what you presented and why you were asked to
Well,
present?
I guess to give you more background first, it was actually resulted from an idea when I was the manager of support services and Linda Deere was the executive director. And I had approached her about the idea of maybe figuring a way to do some kind of town hall type of meeting with the community to try to engage the community more. I think KSCS lacked, and still lacks, we're working on it, efforts or methods to really engage community input, reactions, or comments in some way. So we had approached the idea, she was game for it, but it just never panned out for some reason. When I started in my role this past year, last April, I ended up going for lunch with Mike DeLille at one point just to connect. I mean, I needed to establish networks within the different organizations.
Right.
So we had talked about the idea of maybe jumping in on the community meetings as some form of engaging the community.
Right.
So we had thrown around the idea throughout the course of the year, and then in February, it was now approaching the new year. I was wanting to get something going. We weren't quite ready for February, so we said, look, let's do something for March. So March timeframe came around and said, look, why not? He asked me how long I needed, and I said, probably 10 minutes plus time for questions. It ended up being close to an hour that we spoke. There was a lot of very valuable questions. My presentation mainly was about, I gave a general history of KSCS, of how it's evolved. I gave some statistics on addictions and what kind of the picture is, because I do want to try to start letting the community know in different ways really what is the picture we're seeing. And I think a lot of times as individuals or even as community members, we don't pay attention to things unless it directly impacts us. We don't hear about an addiction unless there's an addict in our family.
Right.
We don't know about special needs unless we know somebody who has special needs. So I think sometimes we turn a blind eye or we become apathetic of some of the problems that are happening until we become aware of what they are.
Well, here in Kahnawake, I mean, maybe you could give us what is the picture? What are we dealing with? I know a lot of people tend to talk about these things behind closed doors, in groups of friends, at the kitchen table. It's, sometimes you hear about things that are going on, but what is the reality of the issues that we're dealing with as a community in terms of addiction? Just lay it out there.
Well, it's a big question, right? I guess addictions in general is rising. On the one hand, to give you some figures, and I think I quoted it, and I failed to bring it with me today, but the actual stats, it's like within this past year, we've had at least 65 individual community members come in over the past 5 years. Now, some come in, go back out, come back in, so there's repeat customers, if you will.
Right.
Because particularly with addictions, it's a process. The further you go down, the more opportunities you'll have at creating an intervention, right? Meaning, I get in trouble with the law, I'm exposed to something at that point. I lose my family, I'm exposed again to the possibility of getting help, getting sober. So as that scale goes down, there's more opportunity, but they become harder and harder, the impact of my addiction, Overall, a good 17% of the community in some form or fashion is impacted by addictions. And those are just very much approximation figures. And that's based on people who've actually come in for help. We're not talking about all the people who've never come in once or have gone back out and never come back in again. This is just in the last year of how many people have come in.
So 65 being in what range and in what capacity? Like age range, and then also in what sort of addiction?
Age ranges can be anywhere from 15 all the way up to elderly. Usually around, and this is totally a rough guess, usually around mid-30s is when you get your first interventions of people. Mainly because when they're teenagers and they come in, often it's a referral by a parent or the school that there's appears to be some type of drug or alcohol problem. And there's that first shock that happens. Throughout somebody's 20s, and I mean, most people can attest, you're invulnerable. Nothing, it won't happen to me. And you didn't lose anything quite yet. So a lot of times people are exposed to drugs or alcohol and they look at it as experimentation and not seeing it as an issue.
Right.
Once you start hitting your 30s and the impact of an actual addiction as opposed to, I guess, getting off that and going on a different path, that's when it really starts to impact people. And it impacts families and it impacts, you know, parents because they've had enough now. You've burned all your bridges, you know, all of those kinds of things. If they survive through that, then you hit the 40s, 50s when it really starts, you've already lost those, now it's more maybe health impacts or, you know, legal problems or some of those things start hitting. So obviously it depends on each individual case of how it could be impacted for age range. For, I guess, substance use, the most common is alcohol. Most are cross-addicted with something like cocaine or crack or something like that, particularly because our community has a lot of disposable income in many areas. There's more affluency with that. So we see more cocaine as opposed to, let's say, crystal meth, which is very cheap in comparison, is much more dangerous. The third one is absolutely marijuana. Now, many of those are interrelated, you know, but why marijuana? Many people view it as it's not an issue, it's not a drug, it's not addictive. But consistently smoking marijuana creates apathy, creates depression. You know, there's proven statistics on it, even though it's natural. You know?
It's natural, and a lot of times, you know, the professionals will say, well, it's a gateway drug. It could lead to other things. You always hear that. It's like, it's the gateway drug, you know, but there are actually statistics to back that up and proof that that is the truth. What is the lowest age that you would say that there was an issue with addiction, or like the youngest here in Kahnawake?
Well, it's hard to say between whether it's an issue of addiction, because as a teenager, it's not necessarily addiction for the most part.
Okay.
Right? You may be an addict as early as, and an addict is simply another word for being dependent on a substance, meaning you have to have the substance, as opposed to abuse of a substance. So most teenagers are abusing some type of substance, whereas later on they develop an addiction for it. But you could even develop an addiction in mid-teens. As far as first use, we've seen cases as early as 6 years old where a children was given alcohol, or it's a party and they sneak drinks, or, you know, I mean...
6 years old.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's not just one case, there's many cases.
Okay, we're going to come back to that. Don't go away. You're watching Our Town here on the Kahnawake Mohawk Television Network. Stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. And welcome back to the program. We're going to just jump right back in. Before the break, we were discussing addictions, and I think I was a little bit shocked to hear the 6 years old. You know, you explained it a little bit better off camera, but now I can understand how a child of that age would be exposed, like we were just discussing about, you know, if a parent is gone to bed, and you mentioned about not cleaning up, and here they come, you know, so that is understandable. But you mentioned a little bit of other things. It doesn't necessarily have to be alcohol or drugs. There's other issues that affect people here in Kahnawake.
Absolutely. I mean, there's simple ones, you know, like, and I say simple, but it's obviously complex, things like grief, mental illness, things like that. But there's also traumatic ones. I mean, a lot of our community suffered traumatic, and you could call it post-traumatic stress disorder, but situations happen, and they're affected at long term, and they pass it on. Things like sexual abuse, residential schools, you know, suicide. You know, as your father or mother or aunt or uncle commits suicide, and you see that, and you could be traumatized after that for years and years, pass that on to your children. But sexual abuse is probably one of the most challenging, or physical abuse, or another common one probably one of the most common youth protection signalements we get is what we call psychological abuse. It's 38C under the Youth Protection Act. And psychological abuse is basically verbal denigration or verbal, yelling, consistently yelling or calling down your child, you're stupid. You're stupid, you're stupid, you're stupid. If you hear that consistently over time, you start to believe you're stupid. And it creates patterns of self-esteem and, of how we perceive ourselves as adults. And then if we're learning those patterns and we think that's normal, we then translate that onto our children.
Right.
That sometimes happens with sexual abuse. If somebody was abused as a child and they normalize that as love or as showing affection, this is what you do. As an adult, you think that's normal, and you could then pass that on. The reality is there's sexual abuse in the community. The reality is that there's physical abuse in the community. There's neglect. Some of the cases that come in, any case that comes in, and we get a lot of times, I think the number this year so far is over 400 different signalements. And what a signalement means is that KSCS receives information about a child that may be at risk for their safety and development. That's considered a signalement. If the information were to be true, then we retain the signalement. If the information that we receive is not sufficient to say the child would be at risk, then we don't retain the information. So we often get information in that we may not retain the case itself. If we retain it, then we have to conduct a preliminary investigation.
Right.
And that's sometimes within a 72-hour period. And we go out there right away, ask information of different people, and determine, is the child at risk? Or is there a potential for the child to be at risk? If there's immediate danger, then we have the authority to remove that child to ensure that they're not in immediate danger. And then within 72 hours, if the family disagrees with this placement, then we have 72 hours to go to the court to explain why we removed this child. Usually we most often try to not have to remove the child. We'll ask the alleged person not to be in contact with the child until the investigation is done. If they refuse, or if the other parent refuses and says, no, we disagree or whatever, then our only recourse is to forcibly remove the child, hopefully with a family member, maybe a grandmother, an aunt, something. If there's no other option, then we'd have to place in foster care.
Right.
That's for a 3-day period. That's all we have. So within that, then we go to court, and we have to explain to the judge why we took measures under emergency conditions to remove the child, and request usually a 30-day period to conduct a longer investigation to determine, are the facts true?
Right. That must be very challenging in a small community.
Absolutely.
Especially where, where Kahnawake jurisdiction in terms of courts and laws are so challenged by many of the families here. How is that, how's that working for you guys? Plain and simple.
Well, every case is different. Without a doubt, we don't want to go to an outside court. That's our last option. Unfortunately, though, when there's a disagreement between our recommendations and a family's wishes, then we need a final arbitrator to say this is what will happen. Right now, our only recourse is the Longueuil court, the youth court there. So that's where we present the cases. We don't have a law in the community. I know in KSCS had under Deyukwatenu was a change process we underwent in 2001-2. We had proposed the idea, and a draft law was created called the Child and Family Responsibilities and Rights Act. And it was intended to replace the Youth Protection Act. Right now, the Quebec Youth Protection Act takes precedence anywhere in Quebec. It's the only law that exists for First Nations communities, there's no First Nation community that has direct authority to handle youth protection, that I'm aware of at least. There are efforts being made towards that. So how the Quebec Youth Protection Act is done is that Quebec, the MSSS, which is the Ministry of Santé and Services Sociaux, they divide Quebec into, I think it's 17 regions. And each region has an appointed director of youth protection.
Okay.
Our region is the Montérégie. So I think it's from St. Hyacinthe down to the border.
Right.
Back in '86, Kahnawake was able to reach an agreement with Montérégie for us to take over our own youth protection services. But we don't have a director of youth protection. Montérégie is still our director of youth protection. So the people that make decisions within the community, which are KSCS, which is essentially our clinical supervisors, they, in essence, are working for technically for the director of youth protection, because that's where their authority is derived from. But KSCS manage that authority according to the way we want to be able to deliver that. The problem is we're limited by the Quebec Youth Protection Act legislature, so we can only operate and have those guidelines that are stipulated in there. Hopefully one day we can have first our own authority derived from Quebec, and then secondly create our own law to replace the Quebec Youth Protection Act, something that's more suited to Kahnawake. The only process we have right now for choosing laws or developing laws is the CDMP process.
Right. Have you discussed as an organization or through your board of directors to go that route?
For sure, they do want to see us try to envision this still. It's obviously going to be a lengthy process.
Of course, because then you have to wonder who's going to enforce the law or who's going to hear those cases.
You need a court. Otherwise, we're still using the Longueuil Court, and that's their laws, not our laws. So there's a lot of work.
Yeah, and our court is not set up for that kind of endeavor. Not yet. Justice Act is in development. Go ahead.
The final thing too is to take into account those aspects like the Longhouse or other people who don't believe in that outside system.
Right.
So we have to be able to design interventions based on the beliefs and values of each individual people. If they want to involve the Longhouse, we've worked with the Longhouses before. There was one case that we worked in Aguesasne, and the Longhouse wanted to help step in and care for the family. And we supported that. So we're open to whatever intervention as long as it's for the greater benefit of the children or the family in the long run.
Of course, still I would imagine that it's all very, sticky.
For sure.
In the area of law and jurisdiction, and can be overwhelming at times. Don't go away. We're going to be right back after this quick break. You're watching Our Town here on the Kahnawake Mohawk Television Network. And welcome back to the program. You're watching Our Town, and in studio with us today, we have Executive Director of KSCS, Kahnawake Sagotigenhas Community Services, Derek Mentor. I think this morning I called for you, and it was really funny because I had like this long pause on the phone, and the receptionist is like, hello, and I was like,
it happens a lot.
Which is funny because I had just seen him at Cafe Delight this morning, so it was like in my mind. But anyways, we're moving on. We were talking about addictions and then got into law and youth protection. Now, over the years, how has community services changed as, how are we dealing with all of these issues as a community? And it's a little bit alarming to hear that, addictions is on the rise, considering we have this big, organization now that seems to have grown over the years.
Well, I mean, to be honest, I've not taken statistics of how many community members do we have that have an addictions issue, that are sober, that have never used. I can't answer that. I do know from, I guess if you take a step back and we look at generations past, when parties, baptisms, there was and my mom used to describe it, where the bathtub was full of beer. Every party was a bash, there was violence everywhere, but there was also less alcohol establishments within the community. Right now we have, there's the ABC board that has approved X amount of distribution points, if you will. There's still the 4 social clubs. There's now poker rooms and other areas. So the prevalence of alcohol and other systems are still very much there. It's also become much more normalized, whereas in the past it wasn't, so it became a taboo, so it was partying and it was kind of a standard. Now we have parties and weddings and others who are sober. There's sober parties. There's a lot of people who are on a clean path. We've also re-engaged our own identity and our own culture, particularly after the 70s, where many people have chosen a path of abstinence, and not using it all their entire lives, with the belief that that's not our way.
Right.
So is it on the rise or not? I made that as a general statement.
Right.
I do know that we have had more what we call comorbid cases, meaning somebody who has both an addiction and a mental health disorder. And that complicates things, because when you're trying to provide treatment, do you first try to arrest the addictions issue, or do you first try to address, let's say, the bipolar issue or schizophrenia or whatever the case may be? Or how do you link the two? Sometimes somebody uses marijuana as a way to suppress mental health issues. So it's really intertwined on how do you try to do a complete intervention plan. And you throw in other disorders like an anxiety disorder and an eating disorder all within the same one, and it becomes really challenging to try to provide a comprehensive service plan to address it.
I bet. I mean, how has the organization changed over the years? And it's definitely grown. Was that based on need?
For sure, a need, opportunity. I think in particular, Donnie Horn was a visionary. He had, and the team is still excellent, but they had reached opportunities of negotiating with the government, and the government at the time had been throwing money in many ways. So it started with taking over, and it goes back to like Mary Cross when she was on the Mohawk Council and working with the church, and then having a discussion with the CSS Richelieu to get jurisdiction or authority for our own youth protection services. That was kind of a start. And then there was the community health representatives that was added. There was something called the New Day program, which was an addictions program. There was a relationship with the Onondaga, and they had an outreach service, so that was in support of it. That outreach service closed, so we created our own addictions response services. Satasanayo, a prevention program, was created out of, excuse me, NADAP, or the National Native Addiction, Alcohol and Drug Addictions Prevention Program, something like that. NADAP, essentially. So it was a national program was created that gave funds. We created Satasanayo based out of that. And so it was alcohol and drug prevention. We had a program that was created called Healing the Family Circle, which is a violence prevention program. Yeah. There was efforts then to send people to wellness conferences and different efforts where there was a whole resurgence of wellness activities. Psychological service, we took over some funding for it and delivered it ourselves, as opposed to, because we noticed community members were being taken advantage of by individual service providers. So we kept bringing all these pieces in, ultimately with the goal of having a multidisciplinary approach. The problem outside the community often is that services operate independently, and they're not often linked very well.
Right.
The advantage we have is that youth protection works in the same office as addictions, as parenting, as psychological services, as youth groups, whatever the case may be. That creates some complications as well with sharing information and making sure there's I guess conducive plans or well integrated plans. Sometimes there's disagreements internal, but a lot of times it's really trying to develop the best service plan for somebody. Without a doubt, the challenge will always be an individual's willingness to change. One of the hardest things in life for anybody is to look in the mirror and decide they need to change, and then to actually take the steps to change. You know, and nobody's given a manual when we're born on how to live healthy lives. You know, we're products of our DNA for one, but also, you know, our upbringing and society and our friends, and all those have influences, and all those decisions dictate, you know, what types of lives we lead. All our role is, and our mission is, to try to encourage people to obtain healthier lifestyles. You know, maybe it speaks back to our mission statement. So as an evolution, we've grown based on different needs, but always realizing that a youth protection worker can't change a family unless we have parenting services. So let's get a parenting program in place. Okay, now we need an addictions program in place. Now we need psych services in place, you know, and that's how it ended up evolving to where we're at today. The big challenge as we enter the future, I think, is we have a community health plan that identified the top 7 health priorities. There are other priorities besides those, in my opinion. So I think although the community health plan is a good tool, I think it could be improved. And KSCS as a whole has to develop a better, more comprehensive strategic plan. And that's really the next effort for KSCS, is to get our strategic plan. Because at one point, we can't meet all the needs. So what are the highest priorities, or what will create the most impact? Or another way to put it is, are we making a difference? With all this money, well, that's the question we got to prove, right?
Okay, so you're not able to answer that right now.
Well, I like to believe we're making a difference.
Okay.
Do
but
I
mean,
have
like, in
the evidence
terms
to
of
show
evidence,
you?
Yeah.
That's what I can show you next year. How about that?
Okay. What are the top 7?
There's addictions, mental health. They call it learning and developmental disabilities, diabetes, obesity, cancer. That's it. That's 7.
Wow.
Those are the identified ones.
Okay.
I would probably throw in violence in there as an additional topic. I could probably, although it's arguable, I could probably put all of youth protection services under violence, meaning it's some form of abuse in some way.
Right. I know you always hear a lot of things about community services in terms of how they're intervening in family and family lives, and it's a small community still, so you hear somebody who had an issue over here, and as a reporter, I've gotten calls over the years from families and different things like that too, and it's almost heartbreaking sometimes, to hear some of the stories that are going on in Kahnawake in terms of family violence and addictions, and when we hear things as journalists, it's always that approach of, we're just listening and we can't really do much because it is in the hands of community services, but also the fact that the youth protection law protects minors from being mentioned, or is it even a news story? It depends, but I would imagine that in a small community that this could be a very challenging area to work in.
Absolutely, it's a challenging area.
What support services do you offer for your staff, I guess, is...
Well, I think that's the key is number one, we have to create a strong team. The managers and team leaders and supervisors are key to that, because it is very draining. It's a demanding profession, and it's not just youth protection workers. A lot of working with elders can be challenging as well.
Right,
working in a lot of the fields we're in. I think youth protection is one of the more challenging areas for sure. I think the big thing is a youth protection worker has to, for one, remember that, I guess the best way I could put it is somebody has to stand up for a child when they may not be able to stand up for themselves. Now, that's not to make an assumption that the parents are not standing up for them, or they're not protecting them, they're not providing for them. The problem is when we get a signal ma, we don't know.
Right.
We don't knock on doors saying, hey, is there any youth protection issues here today? Information comes to us for some reason that's saying you need to look into this. So we can't make assumptions one way or the other. We have to ask the questions.
So can anyone just call and say, I think this is going on in this house and you better check into it? Do you have to check into it at that point?
Well, based on that information of what you just said, what did you see, when did you see it, you know, is there verifiable
evidence? There's an investigation
evidence
into that call, yeah.
Yes, and that's where it's retained or not.
However it comes in,
right?
yeah.
So if was there custody issues going on? You know, is this the first call? Is there other corroborating evidence? You know, you say this child was beaten. Okay, you go to the school and ask, have you noticed any issues? No, the kid's happy all the time. There's no issues. It may not be retained at that point. So we don't jump in and automatically assume something's wrong.
Knocking on the door,
but it's starting to ask what the questions are.
Okay.
And unfortunately, maybe not unfortunately, fortunately due to the Quebec Youth Protection Act, we can't divulge the information of a particular client.
Right.
So the challenge we're under as workers is that a community member could say whatever they want about what's happening within the case. We may have a different picture about what this community member is representing. You know, and there may be disagreements in that. You know, I remember a situation one time where, you know, a parent dropped off their child and said, you know, you fixed them. And then walked out the door and they were heard talking to another community member saying, oh, they took my child. You know, we can't say anything about that.
Yeah.
You know? Are there challenges? Are there, you know, sometimes, you know, we think this is the best service plan, but it doesn't go according to the plan, or it didn't work out the quite way, you know, and it does fall on our responsibility, but sometimes things don't work out. Mistakes can happen sometimes. Ultimately, we're trying to do the best we can with what we know at the time. You can wait a day and all of a sudden the information changes, you know, but that's the reality, is we're trying to deal and manage a situation that is continually changing.
Okay. Is there anything else you feel is important to add or that you want to say before we wrap up?
Well, I had mentioned briefly about the strategic planning that we're entering, and it'll probably be throughout the course of this year. As one element of that, I do hope to do, I guess, what I'm calling a report card. And it's almost, I'd like to know, how is KSCS doing right now? You know, from our service provision, you know, from our clients who've actually received service, from our partners, from the workers themselves. How do you think our service is? And secondly, the processes themselves. Are we working effectively together? You know, is there better ways? So I hope to do that, and I hope to get community participation. I presented that at the community meeting as well. So we're going to be putting out different efforts. Actually, the first one is coming up, and that's dealing with special needs within the community. And we're kind of doing an evaluation process, particularly with those who have received services of some sort, either through us or through Step by Step. And we're going to do some more promotion with Mike DeLillo and I on the radio and other efforts to try to promote that a little bit more.
Great. So we're hoping to have you back here again quarterly now. Well, thank you for coming on. It was definitely an interesting interview. If you have any comments or questions regarding the interview heard or seen here today, just give us a quick email at mohawktv@hotmail.com or give us a call at 632-9449. But if you or a member of your family need the help of community services, they can just simply call in.
Just call, ask for intake at 450-632-6880 and ask for the intake worker, and they'll help you, direct you to where you need.
Exactly. So thanks again for watching, and we appreciate you staying with us here on the Kahnawake Mohawk Television Network. And stay tuned as we go online this week to www.kahnawake411.com. It's a whole new media experience, and we hope you enjoy it. So Nyawagawa Dana Onagiwahi.
Kanya ke haga thadi adaraste kayerniga hiadu zewaderoru.